Elias Thorne stands on the dusty main street of Redemption Gulch, the Wyoming sun beating down on the back of his neck. In his hand, a cluster of prairie wildflowers, already starting to wilt, feels foolish and heavy. The stagecoach was 3 hours late, and with every passing minute, a knot of anxiety tightened in his gut. He had traded letters with a Miss Clara Mayhew of Ohio for 6 months. Her words were like cool water, speaking of a fondness for open spaces and a desire for a life built on honest work and quiet companionship. He had allowed himself to believe, the answer to the suffocating silence of his remote ranch. The coach finally rumbles into town, a cloud of alkali dust in its wake. Passengers disembark, weary and grim-faced, but none of them are the woman from the small, faded photograph in his breast pocket. His heart sinks. He approaches the driver, a grizzled man wiping his face with a red bandana. "Looking for a passenger," Elias says, his voice rough from disuse. "A Miss Mayhew." The driver spits a stream of tobacco juice. "Mayhew? Oh, she arrived about a week ago." Her palm met her. He jerks a thumb towards the far end of the street, where the largest, loudest building in town squats under a gaudily painted sign. "You'll find her in the gilded cage." A cattleman leaning against a post overhears and lets out a short, ugly laugh. "Looking for a bride in a place like that, friend? You got more hope than sense. Well, that's one way to meet." Before these two figure each other out, tell us, what's the most unexpected way you've met someone important? Share your story in the comments. And if you love a surprising romance, hit that like button. The Gilded Cage Saloon. Elias knows the place by reputation, a mire of cheap whiskey, desperate gambling, and women whose laughter never quite reached their eyes. It is the last place on God's green earth he would expect to find the woman whose letters spoke of baking bread and listening to the wind in the pines. A cold dread, sharper than any winter wind, settles over him. He drops the dying flowers into the dust. He pushes through the swinging batwing doors, the roar of the saloon hitting him like a physical blow. The air is thick with the stench of stale beer, sweat, and cheap perfume. A tinny piano fights against the cacophony of shouts and laughter. And then, the noise seems to fall away. On a small, rickety stage at the back of the room, a woman is singing. She wears a dress of garish red satin that doesn't fit her properly, her face painted into a pale, tragic mask. But her voice cuts through the grime and the smoke. A pure, aching melody that speaks of lost things and broken promises. His stomach clenches. He recognizes the gentle slope of her nose, the curve of her jaw from the photograph. He knows, with a sinking, absolute certainty, that this sad angel in a sinner's dress is Clara Mayhew. Elias found a spot against the back wall, the rough-hewn planks a stark contrast to the churning confusion inside him. He had spent a year saving the money for her passage, selling 2 of his best yearlings to do it. The correspondence had been his lifeline through a winter that was as lonely as it was cold. After his parents had succumbed to fever 2 years prior, the ranch had become a silent monument to his solitude. The work was endless, the quiet evenings more so. He wasn't a man for poetry or grand pronouncements. He needed a partner, a helper. He needed a wife. The letters from Clara had been carefully penned, filled with practical questions about the climate and the soil, but between the lines, he had sensed a spirit that matched his own, grounded, hopeful, and weary of a crowded world. She wrote of her father, a watchmaker with unsteady hands and a dreamer's disposition, and her desire for a life with purpose. Nothing in her words had hinted at a voice that could silence a room of drunken cowboys, or a future on a saloon stage. As she finished her song, the applause was scattered and coarse. She gave a small, automatic curtsy and stepped down, her eyes scanning the floor as if to avoid looking at any single face. Elias watched a burly man with a walrus mustache grab her arm as she passed. She flinched, pulling away with a quiet but firm shake of her head before disappearing behind a stained curtain. The proprietor, a man Elias recognized as Silas Blackwood, watched the exchange from his perch by the bar. Blackwood was a vulture in a waistcoat, a man who profited from the town's every vice. A possessive, calculating look was on his face as he watched Clara, and in that moment, Elias understood this was no simple misunderstanding. This was a cage, and she was the canary. He waited, his patience a thing carved from the land itself. When she finally emerged again, carrying a tray of drinks, he moved to intercept her, blocking her path to a table of loud-mouthed prospectors. Miss Mayhew. Her head snapped up. Her eyes, a startling shade of blue beneath the clumsy paint, widened in shock and something that looked painfully like shame. She recognized him. Mr. Thorne. Her voice was a whisper, a ghost of the powerful instrument he had just heard. I came to meet the stage, he said, keeping his voice low and even, though a cold anger was beginning to build in his chest. I was told I'd find you here. Her gaze dropped to the sticky floorboards. My father, there were complications. A debt. A debt. Before she could answer, Blackwood materialized at her side, his smile oily and thin. Is there a problem here, friend? The little lady has work to do. He draped an arm over Clara's shoulders, a gesture of ownership that made Elias's hands clench into fists at his sides. My business is with Miss Mayhew, Elias stated, his tone flat and unyielding. We have an arrangement. Blackwood laughed, a wet, unpleasant sound. An arrangement? Well, so do I. Her father, a man with champagne tastes and ditchwater pockets, racked up a sizable bill at my poker table. Signed a contract to have his daughter sing it off. A debt of honor. You might say he produced a folded, grimy paper from his coat. She owes me $200. Until that debt is paid, she sings for my customers. And she's very, very good for business. $200. The sum hit Elias like a punch to the gut. It was a fortune, more cash than he saw in 6 months. It was the price of a prime bull, of a new well. It was an impossible amount. He looked at Clara, saw the quiet desperation in her eyes, the humiliation that bowed her shoulders. The woman who had written of planting a garden and learning to mend fences was trapped here, a commodity to be bought and sold. He thought of the silent cabin, the empty chair across from his hearth. He thought of the wilted wildflowers in the dust outside. A quiet, unshakable resolution settled over him. This was not the bargain he had made, but it was the one he would honor. I'll pay it, Elias said, the words tasting like iron. But she comes with me. Now, Blackwood's eyes glinted with avarice and amusement. He enjoyed this. I'm afraid it doesn't work that way, Thorne. I'm not running a charity. She stays until the last cent is in my hand. You bring me the money, you can have her. Until then, she's mine. Elias left the saloon, the stale air clinging to him like a shroud. The righteous anger that had propelled him to confront Blackwood now settled into a cold, hard knot of reality. He didn't have the money. His assets were tied up in land and livestock, and the ranch was barely breaking even as it was. But the image of Clara's haunted eyes was burned into his mind. Leaving her in Blackwood's clutches was not an option. He went first to the bank, but the banker, Mr. Abernathy, simply shook his head. Elias's land was his only collateral, and without a proven profit, a loan of that size was out of the question. Dejected, he walked to the town's general store. On a shelf behind the counter sat his father's silver pocket watch, an intricate piece he'd pawned months ago for seed money. It was his last tangible connection to the man who had taught him everything about the land. With a heavy heart, he sold it outright to the proprietor for $30. It was a pittance, a single drop in an ocean of debt. That evening, he returned to the saloon. He couldn't bear to watch her on the stage again, to see the way the men looked at her, so he waited outside, leaning against the wall in the alley. When she finally left through a back door, looking exhausted, he was there. He held out a small sack containing a meat pie and a bottle of milk he'd bought from the town diner. She stared at the offering, her eyes welling with tears. They sat on a discarded crate in the darkness, the saloon's raucous noise a world away. Between bites, she told him the whole sordid story. Her father, Walter, had arrived in Redemption Gulch a week before her, intending to prepare the way. Instead, he had found Blackwood's poker table. Confident he could win her a dowry, he had proceeded to lose everything, borrowing against his daughter's impending arrival. When the debt was called, he had signed the contract, packed his bags, and disappeared on the morning stage, leaving Clara to face the consequences. Elias listened without interruption, his jaw tight. His anger was not for Clara, but for the feckless man who had abandoned her, and the predator who was now exploiting her. It's not your fault, he said, the words simple and solid. But it is my shame, she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. I wrote you such hopeful letters, Mr. Thorne. I painted a picture of a life I wanted, and now this. The picture is not so different, he said, surprising himself. The life is still there to be had. This is just a muddy patch in the road. He started taking on extra work. By day, he broke his back at the freight yard, loading and unloading heavy crates for $1 a day. The work was brutal, his muscles screaming in protest, but with every splinter in his hands, he felt a grim satisfaction. He was earning her freedom, inch by painful inch. He gave up his room at the boarding house and began sleeping on a cot in the livery stable, the smell of hay and horses a comfort after the stench of the saloon. Every dollar he made went into a small leather pouch. He visited Clara each night in the alley, bringing her food, offering a few quiet words of encouragement. They learned each other in these stolen moments. He saw past the painted face to the resilient woman beneath, a woman with a sharp mind and a gentle heart. He discovered she had a dry wit that surfaced when she wasn't so afraid. She, in turn, saw past his stoic, dusty exterior to the man of profound honor who was sacrificing his own comfort and pride for her. She saw the exhaustion etched around his eyes and knew it was on her behalf. Hope, a fragile and unfamiliar feeling, began to take root in her heart. He was no longer just the faceless rancher from the letters. He was Elias, the quiet man who brought her milk and promised her a way out. After 2 weeks of relentless labor, he had scraped together $63. He presented the partial payment to Blackwood, who simply sneered at the small sum. At this rate, farmer, she'll be singing here till she's old and gray. Which might be next week. The way you're working yourself. He began to make Clara's life more difficult, forcing her to wear dresses that were more revealing, making her sing later and later into the night, until her voice was raw. He was trying to break them, to prove that his power was absolute. The taunts only hardened Elias's resolve, but desperation was a bitter pill. He knew he couldn't earn the money fast enough. Blackwood would keep moving the goalposts, keep finding ways to own her. There was only one thing left to do. He had a small, 20-acre parcel of land on the northern edge of his property. It had a spring-fed creek and was the best grazing land he owned. His father had always said it was their future, the key to expanding the herd. Selling it would feel like cutting off a limb. But a future without honor, a future where he had walked away and left her in that saloon, was no future at all. Clutching the deed in his hand, Elias walked into the office of the town land agent, a balding, perpetually flustered man named Henry Gable. Gable disliked Blackwood, whose saloon he considered a blight on the town's already questionable reputation. He examined the deed and the map, his eyebrows rising. "This is prime land, Thorne," Gable said, peering over his spectacles. "The creek runs year-round. You could get $200, maybe $250 for this if the right buyer comes along." $250. It was more than enough. A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees washed over Elias. As Gable began to draw up the sale notice, the office door opened and Sheriff Miller stepped inside. Miller was a tall, weary man who had seen too much of the West's cruelties. He was a man who operated by the letter of the law, but his eyes held a deep-seated sense of justice. "Thorne," the sheriff said with a nod. "Gable, I've been hearing whispers about you and Blackwood's new singer." Before Elias could answer, a frantic energy from the street caught their attention. One of Blackwood's lackeys was hurrying towards the saloon. News traveled fast in a town this small. Blackwood had likely heard of Elias's visit to the land agent. A plan, ugly and desperate, was forming in Elias's mind, but he needed to know where the law stood. He looked Sheriff Miller square in the eye. "He's holding her on a debt contract signed by her father. For $200. He won't let her go until it's paid." "A debt contract is a legal document," Miller said slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "What if he changes the terms?" Elias pressed. Just then, Blackwood himself appeared at the door of the land office, his face flushed with anger and smug triumph. "Thorne, I heard you came into some money. Good thing, because I've been tallying up my expenses. Miss Mayhew's room and board, dresses, protection, not to mention the interest on her father's debt. The price is now $300. Cash." It was a blatant, cruel power play. He had no intention of ever letting her go. Despair crashed over Elias. The land sale wouldn't be enough. He was trapped. But Sheriff Miller had heard enough. He looked from Blackwood's sneering face to Elias's stony, defeated one. "Blackwood," the sheriff said, his voice dangerously quiet. "A contract for labor to pay a debt is one thing. But you start adding fees to make that debt impossible to pay. That starts to sound an awful lot like indentured servitude. And I take a very dim view of that practice in my town." Blackwood blanched, but his arrogance held. "It's just business, Sheriff. See that it stays that way," Miller warned, before turning his gaze back to Elias. It wasn't a promise of intervention, but it was a crack in Blackwood's armor. It was an idea. Elias walked out of the office, leaving the land deed on Gable's desk. He wasn't going to sell his future. He was going to fight for it. He went to the bank and withdrew every cent he had to his name, $160. He added the 30 from his father's watch and the 63 he had earned at the freight yard. It came to $253, more than the original debt. He put exactly $200 into a canvas sack and put the rest in his pocket. He wasn't going to pay Blackwood's inflated price. He was going to call his bluff. That evening, the gilded cage was at its peak. Smoke hung in a thick blue haze, and the noise was a deafening roar. Clara was on stage, singing a mournful ballad. Her voice was strained, the light in her eyes all but extinguished. Elias Thorne walked through the batwing doors. He did not stop at the bar or take a place along the wall. He walked directly through the crowd, which parted before his silent, implacable advance, until he stood at the foot of the stage. He waited until she finished her last note, and in the smattering of applause that followed, he held up the canvas sack. "Silas Blackwood," his voice boomed, cutting through the saloon's din. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to him. Blackwood pushed his way forward from the bar, a scowl on his face. "What is this, Thorne? A public spectacle? I'm here to pay Clara Mayhew's debt," Elias announced, his voice ringing with clarity. He tossed the heavy sack onto the stage. It landed with a satisfying thud. "There's $200 in there. The price you named." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. He gestured at Clara. "I told you, the price went up. Board and fees." Elias didn't look at Blackwood. He turned and addressed the silent, watching crowd of miners, cowboys, and drifters. "This man is holding this woman against her will, over a gambling debt her father signed away. Now that I've come to pay that debt, he invents new charges to keep her here, to keep her singing for his profit." He paused. Then his eyes found Clara's on the stage. He said the next word with deliberation, a brand upon the silence. "I came here for my wife." A collective gasp went through the room. Clara's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and a dawning, brilliant hope. "I am offering the original debt," Elias continued, his gaze sweeping the room, "in front of all of you as witnesses. Now, Mr. Blackwood can take this money and let an honest woman go to her husband. Or," he turned, his voice dropping to a hard, cold edge as he pointed towards the saloon doors, "he can explain to Sheriff Miller why he's practicing slavery in this town." As if on cue, the batwing doors swung open. Sheriff Miller stood there, arms crossed over his chest, his badge gleaming in the lamplight. He wasn't there to make an arrest. He was there to watch. This was the true gamble. Blackwood's power was built on intimidation and the assumption that no one would dare challenge him. But to be publicly accused of something as vile as slavery, with the sheriff himself as a witness, was a threat to his entire enterprise. He could see the tide of opinion in the room turning against him. He was a predator, not a fool. In that frozen moment, Clara made her choice. She stepped down from the stage, her cheap satin dress rustling. She walked past Blackwood without a glance and came to stand at Elias's side. Her hand, small and trembling, found his. He closed his fingers around it, a silent, unshakable promise. It was her declaration and his. They stood together, a united front against the rod of this place. The fight went out of Blackwood. He was beaten, outmaneuvered not by force, but by quiet integrity. With a curse, he snatched the sack of coins from the stage. "Fine," he snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "Take the caterwauling canary. She's more trouble than she's worth." Elias didn't spare him another look. His attention was only on the woman beside him. He kept her hand firmly in his. "Let's go home," he said softly. And together, they turned their backs on the gilded cage and walked out into the clean night air. The walk through Redemption Gulch was silent, but it was a silence charged with meaning. He didn't take her to the livery stable, but to the mercantile, which the owner opened for him with a curious but respectful nod. Using the $53 left in his pocket, Elias bought her a simple dress of blue calico, a pair of sturdy work boots, and a warm shawl. As she changed in the back room, leaving the red satin dress in a heap on the floor, it felt like she was shedding a skin, leaving behind the girl in the gilded cage forever. On the wagon ride out to the ranch, with the lights of the town shrinking behind them, Clara finally broke the silence. "You called me your wife." It wasn't an accusation, but a question full of fragile hope. Elias kept his eyes on the horizon, where the plains met the stars. "The arrangement we made in our letters still stands," he said, his voice steady. "If you'll still have it. If you'll still have me." She looked at his profile in the moonlight, the strong jaw, the steady hands on the reins. These were the hands that had worked themselves raw to set her free. This was the man who had faced down her shame and called it his own. "More than ever, Elias," she said, her voice clear and sure. It was not the voice of a saloon singer performing for a crowd, but the voice of a woman speaking her own heart. They arrived at the ranch near dawn. It was a small, rugged homestead, nestled in a valley that cradled it like a protective hand. The cabin was simple, built of pine and grit, but it was clean and solid. It was a place of quiet and peace. He showed her to the small spare room he had prepared months ago, and for the first time in weeks, she slept without fear. That evening, they sat together on the porch steps, watching the sun bleed colors across the vast, empty sky. The silence between them was no longer awkward or strained. It was a comfortable, shared space. He watched her as she gazed at the horizon, her face scrubbed clean of paint, the tension and shame she had worn for so long finally gone. In the quiet twilight, she began to hum. It was a soft, simple tune, a melody with no words and no audience. It wasn't a song of sorrow performed for coin, but a song of pure, unburdened contentment. Elias leaned his head back against the porch post and listened. The sound filled the empty spaces around them, weaving itself into the whisper of the wind through the grass. For the first time in a long, long time, his quiet house felt like a home. He hadn't just paid a debt for a mail-order bride. He had rescued her voice, and in doing so, had found the missing note in the silent song of his own life. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.